The night Daniel Carter stepped out of his Midtown office building, the temperature had dropped below freezing, and the sidewalk was nearly empty. He almost didn't see her. A young woman collapsed against the bottom step, barefoot on the concrete, her face dark with bruising her coat torn at the shoulder. His head of security moved toward her, first ready to call an ambulance and keep things clean. Then she lifted her head and looked directly at Daniel, and what came out of her mouth stopped everyone on that sidewalk cold. "My father and my brother did that." She swallowed hard and then added that they had sold her to a man named Victor Kane and that Daniel Carter himself had approved the deal. Daniel didn't move for a long moment. The security team stood frozen, waiting for his signal. The woman on the steps hadn't passed out. She was conscious, barely one hand pressed flat against the concrete, like she was trying to hold herself upright, through sheer will. Her feet were bare and red from the cold, and the bruising along her jaw had already turned deep purple. She looked like someone who had been running for a long time before her legs finally gave out. His head of security, a man named Brett, stepped closer to her and said they should call an ambulance and let the hospital handle it. It was the clean move. It was the right move by any reasonable standard of self-preservation. Daniel had a board meeting in less than 12 hours, a daughter asleep at home, and absolutely no reason to pull a stranger's crisis into his life. He knew all of that, and still he crouched down in front of her. "What did you just say?" he asked. The woman lifted her eyes to his. They were dark and steady, which surprised him. He had expected fear or confusion, but what he saw instead was something closer to exhaustion, the kind that comes not from one bad night, but from a long series of them. She repeated it clearly, word by word, as if she had rehearsed it, and was afraid he would find a reason not to believe her. She said her name was Sarah Whitmore. She said her father had agreed to hand her over to a man named Victor Kane in exchange for clearing a debt of more than $2 million. She said her brother Mark had beaten her when she refused. And she said, and this was the part that landed like something cold, dropped into the center of Daniel's chest, that her father had told her Daniel Carter had already approved the arrangement, that his name had been used to convince her the deal was legitimate, that she had nowhere else to go, and so she had come here. Daniel stood up slowly. He looked at Brett, who was already on his phone. Then he looked back at Sarah. "Put the phone down," Daniel said to Brett. Brett looked up, uncertain. "We're not calling anyone yet. Help her up." They brought her inside through the private entrance. Daniel's driver pulled the car around while Brett and another member of the security team helped Sarah to her feet and guided her into the building's side lobby, away from the street cameras and the late-night foot traffic. She didn't protest. She didn't ask where they were taking her. She moved carefully, like someone who had learned a long time ago not to trust easily, but had made a decision tonight to do it anyway. Daniel called ahead to his personal physician doctor, Marcus Webb, and told him to come to the house. Then he called his housekeeper and told her to prepare the guest room on the second floor. He kept both calls brief and gave no explanations. The car ride uptown was quiet. Sarah sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the window, watching the city pass without any visible reaction to it. Daniel watched her for a moment, then turned away. He didn't ask her anything in the car. Whatever she had to say, she would say it when she was warm, when she had been seen by a doctor, and when she was sitting across from him in a room where she felt safe enough to speak without watching the door. That was how he operated in every high-stakes situation. You didn't push. You created the conditions, and then you waited. The house was a 4-story brownstone on the Upper East Side, purchased 7 years ago, when Emily was barely a year old, and Daniel had finally accepted that the apartment he'd been living in was not a place to raise a child. It was a serious house, dark wood, clean lines, good light in the mornings. A housekeeper named Carol had been with him since the beginning. She met them at the door, took one look at Sarah, and without a word, led her upstairs to the guest room. Emily was asleep. Daniel checked her room before going downstairs, The door half opened, the nightlight on her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. He stood in the doorway for just a few seconds, long enough to confirm she was fine, and then pulled the door gently shut and went back down to wait for the doctor. Dr. Webb arrived 20 minutes later. He was a compact, careful man who had served as Daniel's private physician for 6 years and had learned not to ask unnecessary questions. He went upstairs with his bag, and Daniel sat in the study with a glass of water and a legal pad. He didn't drink alcohol when he needed to think clearly, and tonight, clarity was the only thing that mattered. What Sarah had said on the steps was not something a person invented on the spot. The specificity of it, the name Victor Kane, the figure of more than $2 million, the detail about his name being used to validate the arrangement, none of that had the shape of a fabricated story. Fabricated stories were usually vaguer, more emotional, designed to provoke sympathy rather than deliver information. Sarah had delivered information. Badly injured, barefoot in freezing temperatures, she had still managed to be precise. That precision was what troubled him most. Dr. Webb came downstairs 40 minutes later and gave Daniel a concise summary. 2 cracked ribs, deep bruising across the jaw and left shoulder, lacerations on both palms, consistent with someone who had braced a fall on rough pavement. No signs of anything requiring emergency surgery, but she needed rest, anti-inflammatory medication, and to stay off her feet for at least 48 hours. He left a prescription and his emergency number, and he asked no questions. Daniel went upstairs. Sarah was sitting up against the headboard of the guest bed. Dressed in clothes, Carol had found a plain gray sweatshirt and dark pants, several sizes too large. The bruising looked worse in the lamplight. She had her hands folded over the blanket, and she watched him come in without changing her expression. He sat down in the chair across from the bed and set the legal pad on his knee. "Take your time," he said, "but I need all of it. Everything you know." Sarah looked at him for a moment. Then she began. Her father, Robert Whitmore, had spent the better part of a decade making bad investments and borrowing money from people he shouldn't have borrowed from. Victor Kane was not a banker and not a broker. He operated somewhere in the space between legitimate finance and organized pressure, lending large sums to desperate men at terms that were designed to be impossible to meet, and then collecting in whatever form suited him. Robert had gone to Kane 2 years ago with a real estate project that had since collapsed entirely. The debt, with interest and penalties, had grown to just over $2 million. Robert had no assets left. He had no business left. What he had was a daughter who had just finished law school, who was 23 years old, and who, by his own calculation, represented a kind of currency he could still spend. Victor Kane was 51, twice divorced, and had made clear to Robert that he found Sarah attractive. Robert had framed it to Sarah not as what it was, but as a business arrangement. She would marry Kane, Kane would clear the debt, and the family would be protected. When Sarah said no, Robert said she didn't understand the situation. When she said no, again, her brother Mark made sure she understood the consequences. Daniel wrote nothing during this part. He just listened. Sarah told him that when she still refused, her father had told her that Daniel Carter had already been consulted and had agreed that the arrangement was reasonable. He had said it with enough confidence and enough detail, mentioning Carter systems, mentioning Daniel's reputation as someone who valued certain kinds of discreet business relationships, that for a moment she had believed it. That had been the most effective part of her father's lie, not the threat, but the suggestion that someone powerful had already signed off on her fate. She said she had spent 2 days trying to verify it. She had read every public article about Daniel Carter she could find, and everything she found contradicted what her father had claimed. Daniel Carter was not that man. His record was clean. His reputation was built on legitimate operations, and he had never been associated with Kane's name in any context. So she had come here, not to cause trouble, to find out if it was true, and if it wasn't, to make sure someone with actual power knew what his name was being used for. When she finished, the room was quiet. Daniel set the legal pad down. He leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, organizing what he knew. The debt was real. Cain was real. The arrangement was real. And his name had been used not carelessly, but strategically, as a tool to neutralize Sarah's resistance. Someone had understood that attaching his credibility to the deal would make it harder for her to fight. That was not an accident. That was a calculated move by someone who understood how reputation worked. He looked back at Sarah. "You did the right thing coming here," he said. It wasn't reassurance. It was a statement of fact, and he said it that way. "Get some sleep. We'll talk more in the morning." He stood, moved to the door, and then stopped with one hand on the frame. "No one outside this house knows you're here," he said. "Not tonight. That stays true until we decide otherwise." "Understood," Sarah nodded. Daniel turned off the overhead light and pulled the door most of the way shut, leaving just the small lamp burning on the nightstand. He walked back downstairs, sat down at his desk, and opened his laptop. He did not sleep that night. By the time the sun came up over the East River, he had built a preliminary picture of Victor Kane's financial network that was detailed enough to hand to a federal attorney. The question was no longer whether he would get involved. His name had already been pulled in. The question was how he would move and how fast. The morning after Sarah arrived, Daniel made 3 calls before 7 a.m. The first was to his lead attorney, a woman named Patricia Holt, who had handled Carter Systems' legal affairs for 9 years and who had the rare quality of being genuinely unshockable. He told her he needed an emergency consultation private at the house before noon. The second call was to a former colleague at the Justice Department, a man named Gerald Sims, who now worked as a senior investigator at a federal prosecutor's office in the Southern District of New York. Daniel didn't explain everything on that call. He just said he had material that Gerald would want to see and that it involved Victor Kane. Gerald went quiet for a moment when he heard that name and then said he would come in person. The third call was to Carol, asking her to make sure Emily was driven to school at the usual time and picked up at the usual time, and that nothing in the household routine changed. Whatever was happening inside the house, Emily's day would look exactly like every other day. Sarah came downstairs around 8. She moved slowly, one hand lightly touching the wall as she took the last few steps, favoring her left side, where Dr. Webb had confirmed the cracked ribs. Carol had set out coffee and toast, and Sarah sat down at the kitchen table without being told to. She looked more alert than the night before, but no less guarded. The bruising along her jaw had darkened overnight, which was normal, but it made her look like someone who had been through something that couldn't be walked back. Daniel sat across from her with his own coffee and a printed summary of what he had built overnight, a rough map of Victor Kane's known financial entities, cross-referenced with public court records, and 3 investigative news pieces that had never quite gotten traction. He slid it across the table to her, without commentary. Sarah looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, "You did all of this last night." "Most of it," Daniel said. "The rest I already knew." She looked up at him. "You knew about Kane before I came here." "I knew the name," he said. "Kane operates in spaces that overlap with legitimate finance. You can't build a company at Carter Systems level without learning which names to stay away from." I stayed away from him. What I didn't know was that he'd started using mine. Sarah set the papers down and wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She said nothing for a moment, and he let the silence run. Patricia Holt arrived at 11:30. She was a sharp woman in her early 50s, silver-haired and precise, in the way that good litigators tend to be nothing wasted, everything measured. She sat at the dining room table with Daniel, and Sarah listened to Sarah's account without interrupting, and then asked 4 targeted questions about dates, the nature of the debt documentation, and whether Robert Whitmore had put anything in writing regarding the arrangement with Kane. Sarah answered all four. She had a law degree, and she knew what was being assessed. She gave Patricia exactly what she needed and nothing extra. When Sarah finished, Patricia looked at Daniel and said, "This is prosecutable. Kane's exposure on coercion alone is significant, and if there's documentation connecting Robert Whitmore's debt to the explicit transfer of his daughter as settlement, that's trafficking adjacent territory under federal statute. The use of your name is a separate issue defamation, at minimum fraud, if it can be shown he used it to induce Sarah's compliance." Daniel nodded. He already knew most of that. What he wanted from Patricia was confirmation that the path he was considering was viable, not quiet, not contained, but fully public and fully legal. "I want to go to the federal prosecutor's office," Daniel said, "not through back channels, on the record." Patricia looked at him carefully. "That means you become part of the public record too. Your name, your involvement, the fact that you sheltered her." "My name is already part of this," Daniel said. "Someone made that decision for me. I'm just choosing how it ends." Gerald Sims arrived that afternoon. He was a lean, deliberate man who had spent 20 years in federal law enforcement and had the manner of someone who had heard every version of every story and was still capable of being interested. He sat across from Sarah for 2 hours. He asked her to take him through everything. Not the summary version, but the full account, including the timeline, the specific conversations with her father the night Mark had hit her, and the exact language Robert Whitmore had used when he invoked Daniel's name. Sarah went through all of it without breaking. She was precise, and she was consistent, and Gerald made notes in a small notebook without looking up much. When she finished, he closed the notebook and looked at Daniel. "Kane has been on our radar for 4 years, Gerald said. "We've had 2 prior investigations that stalled because witnesses pulled back. If Ms. Whitmore is willing to testify, and if Carter Systems cooperates in providing any documentation related to the misuse of Mr. Carter's name, this moves forward." Daniel said Carter Systems would cooperate fully. Gerald looked at Sarah. "And you understand what testifying means. Your father, your brother, they will be named. They will face charges. There is no version of this where you protect them." Sarah looked back at him steadily. "I know," she said. For the next 10 days, the house operated on 2 tracks simultaneously. On the surface, it was Daniel Carter's home. Emily came home from school each afternoon, did her homework at the kitchen table, ate dinner, went to bed. She knew there was a woman staying in the guest room named Sarah, and she accepted that with the uncomplicated ease of an 8-year-old who had been raised to respect privacy. She asked Sarah once if she was okay, and Sarah had said yes, "Getting better, thank you." That had been enough for Emily. Underneath the surface, Daniel and Patricia were building the case file. Gerald's office had opened a formal investigation. Financial subpoenas had gone out to 3 of Kane's shell entities. Daniel's legal team had compiled a sworn affidavit documenting every instance in which Daniel's name appeared in connection with Kane's operation, all of which traced back to Robert Whitmore. The pressure came quickly. On the 4th day, Robert Whitmore called Sarah's cell phone 7 times. She showed Daniel the call log, and he told her not to answer. On the 6th day, a man Daniel didn't recognize sat in a parked car across the street from the brownstone for 3 hours before Brett ran the plates and had the vehicle flagged. On the 8th day, Patricia received a call from an attorney representing Victor Kane, suggesting that the situation could be resolved privately and that pursuing public litigation would be, in the attorney's words, unnecessarily complicated for all parties. Daniel had Patricia send a 1-sentence response. Carter Systems does not negotiate with parties under federal investigation. It was on the 9th night that Sarah came to find Daniel in the study. It was late past 11, and Emily had been asleep for hours. Sarah stood in the doorway in the gray sweatshirt she'd been wearing since the first night, and she looked like someone who had been sitting with a question long enough that it had started to cost her something. She said, "I need to ask you something honestly." Daniel set down what he was reading and waited. "Is Emily safe?" Sarah asked. "Not in a general sense, specifically with me here. With all of this moving forward, is your daughter safe?" Daniel looked at her for a moment. "Brett has 2 additional people on the perimeter. Emily's school has been briefed that she requires discreet security during pickup and drop-off. Her routine hasn't changed, and no one outside this house and my legal team knows she's connected to any of this." "That's not what I asked," Sarah said. He understood what she was actually asking. She wasn't asking for a security briefing. She was asking whether she was the reason his daughter was now living inside a situation that required additional security personnel and quiet conversations with school administrators. She was asking whether the right thing to do was to leave. "You came to me because someone used my name to justify selling you," Daniel said. "That means I was already in this before you knocked on my door. You didn't pull me in. You just let me know I was already there." Sarah looked at the floor for a moment, then back at him. She didn't say anything else. She went back upstairs. The video surfaced on the 11th day. Investigators later traced it to a former associate of Kane's, who had his own reasons for wanting the story out, had recorded Mark Whitmore at a bar approximately 3 weeks before Sarah had shown up on Daniel's steps. In the video, Mark was several drinks in and talking loudly to a man off camera. He was laughing. He was describing in crude and specific terms how the family had solved its debt problem. He said they had traded the one asset that still had value. He said Sarah had made a scene about it, and that he had handled that. He was smiling when he said it. The video ran for 1 minute and 47 seconds. By the time Gerald's office became aware of it, it had already been viewed more than 400,000 times. By the following morning, the name Whitmore was attached to every major news platform in the country, and Victor Kane's name was beside it. Daniel's name appeared in several of the reports, not as a suspect, but as the man whose name had allegedly been used to facilitate the arrangement, and who was now cooperating with federal investigators. The framing was on balance accurate. That didn't make it easier. Sarah saw the video on Carol's tablet in the kitchen. She sat there for a long time after it ended, not moving. The sound of her brother's laughter compressed into a phone speaker and playing through someone else's kitchen at 7 in the morning was a different kind of damage than the bruises had been. Those had come from anger. This came from contempt. Mark hadn't hit her because he was desperate or afraid. He'd done it and then gone to a bar and laughed about it. She got up from the table and went upstairs without saying anything to Carol. Daniel found out about the video 20 minutes later from Brett. He watched it once, closed the laptop, and called Patricia. The question now was not whether this was going to be a public case. It already was. The question was whether Sarah could hold together long enough to get to the hearing, and whether the exposure of the video would make Kane more dangerous or less. Gerald called an hour later and said in his measured way that the video had accelerated things. Kane's attorney had gone silent. Robert Whitmore's attorney had contacted the prosecutor's office. The investigation, which had been moving at the careful pace of federal procedure, had just been handed a significant amount of public momentum. Daniel went upstairs and knocked on Sarah's door. There was no answer for a moment, and then she said to come in. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at nothing in particular. She had not been crying, which he noticed. She looked like someone in the specific state that comes after the worst thing has already happened. Not grief exactly, but the strange stillness that follows it. "I know," she said before he could speak. "I know what it means. I'll still testify." Daniel stood in the doorway and looked at her. There was nothing useful he could add to that. So he simply said, "Okay," and left her alone. The federal hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late January, 3 weeks after the video had surfaced, and the story had taken on a life of its own in the press. The building was a gray federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan, the kind of place that had been designed to feel permanent and slightly intimidating. Wide stone steps, Heavy doors, long corridors with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look a little worse than they were. Sarah had been inside courtrooms before, during law school, sitting in the gallery and watching other people's lives get decided. This was different. This time, she was the one walking in. Patricia was beside her. Daniel walked on her other side, not touching her arm, not saying anything, just present in the way that people are when they've decided to see something through. Brett and 2 members of the security team followed at a careful distance. The press was outside in a contained area, cameras pointing reporters, calling questions that none of them answered. Sarah kept her eyes forward and her jaw set and walked through all of it without slowing down. The hearing room was smaller than she had imagined. A long conference table, federal seals on the wall, a panel of 4 people seated at the far end, representing the prosecutor's office and the investigative committee. Gerald Sims was among them. He gave Sarah a brief nod when she came in, nothing more. And then she saw them, her father and her brother, seated on the opposite side of the room with their respective attorneys. Robert Whitmore looked diminished in a way she hadn't expected. He had always been a man who filled whatever room he was in with noise and movement and forward momentum, even when everything around him was failing. Seated here in a federal hearing room in a suite that didn't quite fit anymore, he looked like what he actually was, a man who had run out of moves and knew it. He didn't look at Sarah when she came in. Mark looked at her. He held her gaze for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not remorse, not anger. Exactly, something closer to the specific discomfort of someone who has been caught and hasn't yet decided how to arrange his face around that fact. Sarah looked back at him long enough to make clear she wasn't going to look away first. Then she sat down. Victor Kane was seated at the far left of the room, flanked by 2 attorneys, and a man she didn't recognize. He was heavier in person than in photographs, and he had the surface composure of someone who had been in difficult rooms before and had walked out of all of them. He didn't look at Sarah at all. He looked at the panel, at the documents in front of him, at his attorneys everywhere, except at the woman whose life he had attempted to purchase as a debt settlement. The session ran for 4.5 hours. Sarah testified for 2 of them. She went through the full account, the debt, the arrangement the way her father had presented it the night Mark had hit her, the specific language Robert had used when he told her Daniel Carter had approved the deal. She answered the panel's questions directly and without elaboration. When one of the attorneys on Kane's side attempted to suggest that Sarah had misunderstood the nature of the arrangement, that it had been a voluntary introduction, not a transaction, Patricia objected immediately, and the line of questioning was shut down. At one point, Robert Whitmore's attorney asked Sarah whether she had sought out Daniel Carter specifically because of his financial resources and public profile. It was a question designed to reframe her as opportunistic rather than victimized. Sarah looked at the attorney and said, "I went to Mr. Carter because my father told me his name had been used to authorize what was being done to me. I went to find out if that was true. It wasn't." She said nothing else. The attorney moved on. The hardest part was not the questions. The hardest part was the 15 minutes during which Robert Whitmore gave his own account of the debt and the arrangement, sitting 12 feet away from his daughter and describing the decision to use her as collateral in the careful language of a man who had been coached to call everything something other than what it was. He said introduction. He said possibility. He said she had options. He never once looked at Sarah while he spoke, and she sat very still and let him finish and said nothing. Daniel testified for 40 minutes, largely regarding the unauthorized use of his name and Carter Systems' cooperation with the federal investigation. He was composed and specific and gave the panel exactly what they needed without excess. When he left the witness area and returned to his seat, he didn't glance at Kane or at the Whitmore table. He sat down, straightened the folder in front of him, and waited for what came next. What came next over the following 6 weeks was the legal machinery doing what it was built to do when given sufficient evidence and public attention. Victor Kane was arrested on federal charges, including coercion, fraud, and conspiracy. The full scope of his operation, which turned out to be significantly larger than even Gerald's office had initially mapped, unraveling alongside the primary case. Robert Whitmore was indicted on charges related to the arrangement with Kane and the fraudulent use of Daniel Carter's identity in connection with it. Mark Whitmore was charged separately, his own hearing scheduled for the spring. The sentences, when they eventually came, were not light. Kane faced the most significant exposure. Robert Whitmore's attorney negotiated a plea that still carried prison time. Mark's case moved more slowly, but moved. Gerald Sims called Daniel personally when the Kane arrest went through. He said 3 words, "It's done. Congratulations." Daniel thanked him and hung up. Sarah was placed in a federal witness protection program during the period of active prosecution. She stayed in a secure location that Patricia helped arrange with regular contact, maintained through legal channels. The brownstone was quieter after she left. Emily asked about her once a few days after she'd gone, and Daniel told her that Sarah had moved on to something new and that she was okay. Emily seemed to accept that, and they didn't discuss it further. Daniel returned to Carter Systems. He gave one statement to the press, 2 paragraphs drafted by Patricia, factual and clean, and then declined all further interview requests. The story cycled through the news for several more weeks, and then other stories replaced it as they always do. His board never formally raised the issue, which was their way of indicating they considered it closed. He went back to work. 4 months after the hearing, Sarah called him. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Daniel was in the kitchen helping Emily with a school project about the water cycle. They had built a small model out of a glass bowl and plastic wrap, and were arguing in a friendly way about where to place the sun lamp. He stepped into the hallway to take the call. Sarah's voice on the phone sounded different than he remembered. Lighter, not in a forced way, but in the way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has recently set it down. She told him she was still in New York. She had found a position with a small nonprofit that did legal advocacy work for domestic abuse survivors. She was starting in 2 weeks. She was not asking for anything. She was calling because she felt she owed him a real conclusion, not the legal conclusion which had been delivered through official channels, but a human one. She said, "I thought you should know that I'm okay, and that I didn't stay because of you." Daniel leaned against the hallway wall and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "I know," he said. "I stayed because it was my choice," Sarah said. "For the first time in a long time, it was just mine." He understood exactly what she meant. There was nothing to add to it, and he didn't try. "Good," he said. "That's how it should be." There was a brief quiet on the line, and then Emily's voice came from the kitchen, asking if the sun lamp was supposed to touch the plastic wrap or not. Daniel told Sarah he had to go. She said, "Of course." They said goodbye without the weight that goodbyes sometimes carry, which meant the weight was gone. He went back to the kitchen. Emily had moved the sun lamp herself and was now peering at the bowl with intense concentration, her stuffed rabbit inexplicably present on the counter beside her. Daniel stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment, this small, serious person who had slept through all of it, who had eaten breakfast and gone to school and come home and done her homework through the entire 11 days that had changed other people's lives without changing hers. He was glad about that. He had worked hard to make sure it was that way. He walked back to the table and sat down beside her. "Okay," he said. "Tell me your theory about the plastic wrap." Emily looked at him with the particular expression of an 8-year-old who has already figured something out and is deciding whether the adult is worth explaining it to. Then she smiled just slightly and started talking. Outside, the city moved at its usual pace, indifferent and enormous, and full of people making decisions in the dark, some of them good, some of them not. But in the kitchen on the Upper East Side, the sun lamp was in the wrong place, and the water cycle project wasn't going to finish itself, and that was for now exactly enough.